By Luke Bean. I first met Ducky Wooler when I was 16. He had come to Mecklenburg to start a war, and I figured I could get a pack or two of cigarettes out of it. The idea of being invaded didn't worry me much. War, as far as my town was concerned, was the natural state of affairs. Indeed, it was the idea that the invaders might bring peace that troubled the locals. So when this strange American showed up waving around a camera and talking of an age of peace to come, he found nothing but closed doors and pursed mouths. I took pity on this lonely man, and I do not think it is an exaggeration to say we saved each other's lives. Today, of course, Silas Ducky Wooler is the New York Journal's fabled international correspondent, the man who built the case for the pacification of Germany. And though my name, Eric Kalb, is little remembered, I too am famous. I am the subject of Mr. Wooler's most iconic photograph, The Boy and the Banner. In 1950, Mr. Wooler asked me to write a short foreword for the 20th anniversary edition of Ducky in Germany. It is a fascinating work of journalism, and I strongly encourage you to read it. I found it difficult to bottle my feelings on the topic. The story of my travels as Ducky's translator meant little to me without the context of how I had arrived at that point in my life. Soon my short foreword had exploded into 100 pages of anecdotes, arguments, and explanations. If you want to make me look like an idiot, Ducky eventually told me, you can do it in your own damn book. With all respect to Mr. Wooler, I believe there is an error at the heart of his reporting on Germany. My world was not divided into predatory mercenaries and innocent victims. The companies maintained their grip on Germany by making everyone an accomplice to their crimes. At some point, we had all housed them, fed them, traded with them, fought for them. Everyone knew their local company men, and counted family and friends among them. When a boy turned 13, Mecklenburg's largest company, the Duke's Rifles, would come to their door. "Fight with us," the sergeant would say. "You'll come home rich or you'll come home in a box, but either way you'll be a man." They wouldn't actually waste effort carrying your coffin home, but you understood. Ducky once asked me why people didn't turn on the companies. The question made me laugh. Who was there to turn? We were the companies, every last one of us. Won the balloon. One of my earliest memories is of a hot air balloon. I was in town with my mother when it appeared in the distance. She lifted me onto her shoulders to see. We walked around like that, Mother going about her business and me craning my neck to always keep an eye on the distant balloon, as if it was waiting for a chance to slip away. When the balloon came closer, Mother took me off her shoulders and told me not to look at it anymore, but I looked anyway, and she didn't stop me. 3 men dangled from nooses tied to the basket. Mother needn't have worried about me. I thought they were just taking a ride. I still don't understand this. It's clear the hangman wanted everyone to see his handiwork. If it could be read as a threat, that I could accept. This is what happens if you resist conscription. These men collaborated with werewolves. Cause and effect. But if the balloon knew who hung those men, or who they were, or what they did, then it wasn't telling. Maybe someone just wanted death to remain familiar to us, so we would not recoil from its touch. To the Lübeck Watch. I grew up near Grevesmullen, on the very edge of company lands. To the east was Hansestadt Wismar, to the west Hansestadt Lübeck. The Hanseatic cities were an object of fear and fascination for me, lands of unimaginable debauchery. It was held as unimpeachable fact at my school that the merchant princes of the Hansa considered the flesh of children a fine delicacy, and nearly everyone had a friend whose cousin had been sold to Lübeck to be devoured. But alongside the lurid stories, there was the recognition that these strangers were somehow like us. People from Russia or England or the United Kingdom seemed unimaginably alien, but our wayward brothers talked like us and traded with us. They sung foreign tunes in our native tongue. This combination of strangeness and familiarity excited me. Lübeck was a wicked and dangerous place, and I wanted desperately to see it, to slouch between cinemas and cabarets and strangers' bedrooms through streets foggy with cigar smoke. But nobody was allowed into the Hanseatic cities. The Rifles didn't want us getting seduced by their decadent ways. Thinking too much about the outside world was discouraged. We were told history had ended with Wallenstein, and outside Germany nothing of interest had happened ever again. When the Duke's rifles raided beyond Germany, they would target rich Dutch cities, weak Polish towns. Some companies braver and more foolish than the rifles even crossed west into the United Kingdoms before the wall went up, but the Hanseatic cities were untouchable. They bought the company's plunder, processed our poppies, and made the money flow. We were expected to hate and fear them, but not to live without them. There was a lieutenant in the rifles, Eric Gersten, who spent time with my mother. She often had men over, it kept her in good standing with the rifles. Most of them ignored me, but Eric was kind to me, and I think mother loved him a little bit for it. He acted like it was terribly significant that we had the same first name. "We Erics have to stick together," he would tell me. "Listen to your mother and fight bravely for your company and you'll do our name proud." Sometimes I liked to imagine he was my father, and I was named after him, but my mother said that wasn't true. Eric was more pretty than handsome, and could have almost been mistaken for a woman without his sleek red beard. He often tried to keep his face from smiling, but it always found a way. I'd seen mother get angry with him for laughing when she banged her head on a door frame, things like that. He wasn't a sadist, he just couldn't help but find things funny. Eric loved boasting about his adventures, and I loved listening to him. He was proud to be a member of the Rifles. This gentle, happy man was surely responsible for more deaths than he could remember, but that was just part of the job. When he paced back and forth making up stories about daring raids and desperate escapes, I didn't doubt for a moment that I was going to be a company man with the Rifles, and I was going to follow him into battle. One of Eric's most sacred duties was the Lübeck Watch. Once a year he would gather together a band of 15 trusted men from all over Mecklenburg. They would meet in the Hart's Head Tavern and speak in whispers just loud enough to make sure everyone knew they had secret business. When night fell, they would buy everyone a round of drinks, swear them to secrecy, and march off towards Lübeck. They would return the next day, nodding grimly to each other. I could only imagine they were infiltrating Lübeck to some unknown, but presumably exciting, end. I couldn't get Eric to tell me anything about the Lübeck Watch. "I was making sure Lübeck's still there," he said blandly. "It is." When I was 13 I was short for my age, with a young face. If I couldn't look like a man, I was determined to at least act like one, which to my mind mostly involved fighting over imagined insults. The Rifles weren't shy about wasting boys my age as cannon fodder, but I was regarded as officer material. I was just annoyed that it meant they would not take me with them into combat. So when Eric Gersten came to my door in full uniform and announced that he was enlisting me for the Lübeck Watch, I was giddy. I expected mother to set her jaw and growl her disapproval, but she nodded calmly. Eric gave me a uniform. I didn't care that the sleeves covered my hands. I trailed his band of men, trying to match their gait and catch their jokes. I couldn't do either very well, so I ended up spending most of the journey to Lübeck petting the pack mule. We left the road before reaching the city and stopped in a grove of trees. The sloping fortifications in the distance marked the end of company lands. Eric's men began unpacking the mule's bags. They contained folding wooden chairs. Everyone took one, and we marched out of the trees, straight towards the walls of Lübeck. I had no idea what was going on, but I followed along. We unfolded our chairs and sat them in a line at the base of the wall. One of the men opened his backpack and spilled a small pile of rocks on the ground. Another passed around bottled beer. Guards started pooling at the top of the fortifications. They were armed, but seemed more curious than hostile. Eric picked up a stone and flung it up at the guards. It fell short, scuttling down the wall into the trench at the bottom. The guards laughed. Some peeled away to go back to patrols, but others stayed to watch. Eric handed me a stone and grinned. I flung it as hard as I could. And so 15 company men and I sat and spent hours drinking and flinging stones at the walls of Lübeck. The guards shouted insults down and we shouted insults back. Soon my hand was sore and my elbow numb. I loved it. It was about an hour before someone managed to actually hit one of the guards, but the stone struck him square in the face, splitting the guard's lip and drawing an audible yelp of pain. We all hooted and cheered and lifted the soldier who made the throw into the air like he'd just taken the city single-handedly. The crack of rifle fire interrupted our celebration, and one of the folding chairs was split open by a bullet. I wanted to run, but Eric stopped me. "They're aiming around us. Those cowards know what will happen to them if they provoke the rifles." Sometimes the men would wander off to find more stones, or spend a few minutes swapping jokes and stories, but always they returned to throwing stones, until the night. We had picked the area clear of stones. Some of the soldiers had gone to sleep or passed out drunk. I helped Eric start a campfire. Eric looked away from the wall and into the fire and was quiet. He smiled to himself, and for a moment the man who told me adventure stories was replaced with the man who looted cities for a living. It's all well to play at war with them. But we're going to do it one of these days. I know people have been saying that for years, but we're really going to do it. I'm going to reach down those fat bastards' throats and pull the food right out of their bellies. I'm going to get myself a Bernardi autocycle, and I'm going to get your mother a radio. That was in 1925. The next summer was the sack of Lübeck, and Eric Gersten got his wish. 3. The Brown Banner. The Brown Banner was a tradition handed down to the Duke's rifles from the 60 Years' War. When the rifles wanted to punish someone, they would peel a strip of skin off of them, tan it into leather, and sew it onto the banner. Stealing from the rifles might lose you a square of skin the size of your hand, betray them and they'd take every inch of skin. You could tell exactly how each square of skin was forfeited, because the offender's name and a short description of their crimes were etched into every patch. When old banners grew too heavy to carry, they were retired to the great barracks in Schwerin, where they hung from every rafter like sagging folds on an old woman's bones. This is one of Eric Gersten's stories, most of which were pure fantasy, but something about the way he told this one made me believe it. The Duke's rifles were skinning a man for the banner. He'd murdered his wife, and if you wanted to murder someone in Mecklenburg, you'd damn well better belong to the rifles. When Eric took him from his cage and led him to the tannery, he was quiet, almost bored looking. They laid him on the table and he went limp. The moment the knife touched his back, he giggled. As it sliced his flesh, he started laughing. It wasn't that he didn't feel the pain, he was crying and clenching his fists so tight his fingernails broke skin. But the more the flaying hurt, the more he laughed, cackling so loud it started to frighten Eric's men. Eric gagged him, and that stopped the noise, but they could still see his face contorted in laughter. In the end they killed him to make him stop. They took the rest of his skin, but they didn't add it to the banner. The cut was too sloppy from the laughing, and from Eric's hands trembling. 4. History. Schooling was sparse in Grevesmullen, and ended at a young age, but my school made sure we took pride in the parts of our history they were willing to tell us about. I assume my readers have been raised on the Western history of Germany, 300 years of anarchy and bloodshed. Here is the version I was taught. The age of the companies began with the 60 Years' War. Sometimes books called it the 50 Years' War, or the 90 Years' War, or basically any number they felt like. It was confusing because the war hadn't really remembered to end properly. I suppose one day nobody showed up to battle, and then it was over. Every town had its own local heroes from the 60 Years' War, lords or generals or mercenaries who had taken the town under their wing. Grevesmullen's patron savior was none other than the father of our country himself, Albrecht von Wallenstein. Some called him the first captain, or the great liberator, or the king who broke his crown. He'd held 100 titles from admiral to emperor, but he was the Duke of Mecklenburg, so to us he was the good Duke. He led the first companies to war for the emperor to drive out the foreigners. But as Wallenstein grew strong, the emperor came to fear him, until he tried to have Wallenstein killed. Wallenstein evaded the assassins, and when the companies saw how the emperor betrayed his most loyal servant, they proclaimed Wallenstein the only man they'd ever kneel to again. Even the companies that fought for the foreigners were impressed by his promises of land, wealth, and freedom. He deposed the tyrannical emperor and drove off the wicked foreigners, and from that day all the people of Germany grew strong and free. The Duke's rifles were directly descended from Wallenstein's armies. Plenty of companies could make the same claim, but Grevesmullen had few enough things to be proud of, so we took whatever we could get. Among company men, the reverence for Wallenstein was genuine. He had liberated us from the tyranny of the state. Only in Germany was a man free to do as he pleased. If you and your brothers were strong enough, you could take what you wanted. And if you were weak, well, Germany had no patience for weakness as it should be. You could pay a company if you wanted protection, and if you didn't, it was your loss. Everyone wanted protection. Once in a while you'd hear rumors of a town that had the audacity to try to elect a mayor and govern themselves. This kind of statist corruption inevitably met swift justice. Change came slow to Germany. Old companies grew strong, upstart companies toppled them, and the Duke's muskets started using rifles, but the German way of life changed little over the centuries between the 60 Years' War and my birth. This was by design. The Maxim War was a typical example of how the companies reacted to change. In 1889 the Redshanks Company returned from a contract in Swedish West Africa with 10 Maxim machine guns. Within a month, a coalition of 28 companies had formed to oppose the Redshanks, and by the end of the year the Redshanks Company had been wiped out, their company towns sacked, and their Maxim guns smashed to pieces. There was no point, the captains all agreed, in turning war into slaughter. One did not need machine guns to prey on the weak. But progress whittled away at Germany. Not 5 years after the Maxim War, a gunsmith with the Württemberg Knights invented the Daimler automated rifle. Unlike the Redshanks, the Knights were willing to share. The Daimler could be finicky, and if it broke you might not be able to find the parts to fix it, but it was a treasured status symbol and a viciously effective weapon. During the sack of Lübeck a platoon of quartered men with Daimlers held off a Swedish landing force outnumbering them 8-1. As long as the companies spent all their energy on raiding and backbiting, they were regarded as a benign tumor, more harm to operate on than to tolerate. Napoleon had tried to excise the tumor, and look how that turned out for him. But the sack of Lübeck changed everything. Too many companies had cooperated to make it possible, their new automatic weaponry was too powerful, and it was a violation of the implicit accord between the companies and the Hansa. But worst of all, nobody had seen the sack of Lübeck coming. The companies were no longer predictable. The West began building the case for surgery. 5. The Werewolf. When I was 11, I came in from the poppy fields one night and found my mother talking with a man. This man was different from most of the company men who buzzed around my mother, filthy and unshaven, but with a preacher's voice and urgent eyes. Mother told me to go upstairs, but the man said no, I should hear this. He spoke to us of a land of freedom to the south, where a woman did not have to give her body to the companies, where a boy would only be called to war to defend his home, not to burn someone else's. He didn't spell it out, but I knew enough to figure out that he was a werewolf. We ate with him, and then Mother sat with him for hours, nodding and letting him talk. I had 1,000 questions, but Mother grabbed my arm, telling me to close my mouth and open my ears for once. Eventually she sent me to bed. She came upstairs with me, and told me to stay in my room until she came for me in the morning, and to never breathe a word of what happened that night to anyone. In the morning, the Rifles came to our house. They thanked my mother and added the man's skin to the brown banner. The present German government would have you believe the werewolves were virtuous liberators. Don't believe a word of it. They were no better than the companies. They looted towns, raped women, and conscripted boys just the same, they just did it with justice's name on their lips, as if one more blasphemy could turn their sins to virtue. Whichever werewolf band sent that man to Grevesmullen was looking to expand their turf, not set us free. But even if he was lying, that man was the first person to tell me about a world without companies. The second was Ducky. 6. My hand. The air itself seemed to vibrate with excitement before a raid departed. We wanted the wealth. We wanted the food. We wanted the victory. Every indignity the Rifles ever inflicted on Mecklenburg was forgiven in the weeks before and after a raid. I practiced my aim until my trigger finger blistered, popped, and blistered again. I going to see Lübeck, and I was going to bring back whatever I could carry. It took hours of staring at the ceiling before I fell asleep. I woke to unbearable pain. I tried pushing myself out of bed, but my right arm collapsed under me. I dragged my right hand onto my chest to look. It was a bulging, purple mess of swelled meat and jumbled bones. A brief glimpse of my mother standing at the door with a hammer was all I needed to understand what had happened. I screamed every foul word I knew until I ran out of words, and then I screamed incoherent gibberish, and then my tongue gave up and I just screamed. By the time I'd worked up the strength to stand, Mother was long gone. I raced into town without even pausing to tend to my hand. I don't know what I intended to do. Would I have reported my mother? I'm not sure. But by the time I got to Grevesmullen, the rifles had already left for Lübeck. It didn't matter. I'd never be able to fire a rifle, let alone be one. Mother had never spoken ill of the companies, or argued when I talked about joining them. She was loyal to the rifles and they were loyal to her. But I thought I understood. I thought my mother didn't want me to grow up, that she was scared to let her son risk his life, that she wanted me to be a coward so I could be her boy forever. We didn't talk about it properly until years later, when she joined me in Philadelphia. It wasn't that she was scared of me dying. She was scared of me dying for a company. Quietly but fervently, she hated them with every fiber of her being. 7. The radio. 2 days after the rifles set out for Lübeck, a small group of recruits rode back into town, and with them was every horse the rifles had brought. I was with the crowd waiting for our company to return. Word rushed through the crowd that these were the only survivors, then in the very next breath, the story changed. The men were on their way, they just didn't need to ride their horses home. The Duke's rifles drove into town 4 hours later, and every last one of them at the wheel of a Bernardi autocycle. Most of them kept on driving to Schwerin, but our local rifles were heroes like never before. Everyone wanted to drive an autocycle, or ride in one, or at least just honk the horn. By the time people started creeping home to sleep, 3 cycles were stuck in ditches, 1 had crashed through the wall of a house, and nearly half of them were out of fuel. Throughout the night and into the next morning, rifles trickled in on foot from the road to Schwerin, having also crashed their cycles or run out of gas. The men had brought back several barrels of petrol, but it quickly became clear that it wasn't enough to keep the cycles fueled for long, and within a year or so the last of them had run dry. They remained chained up outside houses as rusting monuments, testifying that the men who lived here had their way with the Queen of the Hansa. Eric got Mother her radio. He pulled up at our house the morning after the rifles returned with this huge cabinet radio taking up the driver's seat and him leaning out the side, barely keeping control of the autocycle. Just a week before I'd have laughed my head off. Mother still hadn't come home after breaking my hand, and I wasn't able to help him carry it, so he had to nudge the radio into our house inch by inch. Eric was disappointed that Mother wasn't home to greet him, and probably a little worried. He said what a shame it was about my hand, but he didn't ask for an explanation, and we never really talked about the rifles anymore after that. My mother came home the next day. We didn't talk, but she found the radio, and she read the note Eric had left, and they seemed to cheer her up a little. With my broken hand, I couldn't train to join the rifles anymore, and it was weeks before I could work the poppy fields. The radio became the new center of my life. At first, every broadcast was about Lübeck. It amused me to hear Rostock and Hamburg lamenting our victory. When the Swedes tried and failed to relieve Lübeck from the companies that had stayed to pick it clean, the radio wept and I cheered. At night I stayed quiet to see if I could hear gunfire, but it was too far away. After a few days some of the pleasure went out of the constant coverage of Lübeck. Grevesmullen was raided only rarely, and not as harshly as a town without company protection would have been, but even so Lübeck's plight was not impossible for me to relate to. Sometimes they would broadcast lists of survivors who had been separated from their loved ones, and I turned off the radio for that. But eventually the mournful tributes to Lübeck waned, and my love affair with radio began in earnest. I became a hermit and a man of the world at the same time. I listened to American jazz and English marches and Hansa cabaret and strange atonal Russian music and just about anything else they'd put on the air. Mother took up some of the slack in the poppy fields, partly in penance for my hand and partly on a condition: I was to learn English. The Hanseatic cities had a significant population of refugees who had fled England when the Leveller Party took power, enough to have English-language radio stations. They played detective stories and westerns brought over from the US, and even before I understood what they were saying, I understood the sound of a gruff man and a sultry woman and a gunshot. This was my life for 2 years, hunched over a radio, listening to a world I'd never known. As young love often does, my relationship with the radio came to an end. The radio was hidden in a storage cellar. It was a treasured item, and it was better not to attract attention to it. This worked for a time, but Eric could not be kept from boasting about how he'd brought his woman a radio. Eventually, the rifles were contracted to go off and fight in some foreign war. I'd stopped keeping track, and Grevesmullen was raided. The Strangers Band was led by a man named Heinrich Robledo. He was not born to the life of a company man. He had chosen it. He was from the United Kingdoms. His real name was Enrique and had fought with the Spanish separatists for a long time. They got tired of fighting before he did, so he came to Germany so he could keep fighting forever. The captain of the rifles had offended him somehow, and we suffered the consequences. Robledo came to our door himself with a small group of men. He'd heard we had a radio. My mother had made sure to be far away by the time the Strangers Band arrived, but I had remained behind to help them find anything they needed. It was best not to let raiders look for things on their own, because if they couldn't find them they got frustrated, and that could put them in a destructive mood. I led Robledo to the cellar. He took one look at the radio and spat. "It's too big." "Why's it so big?" he said, as if I'd somehow enlarged it to spite him. I said I didn't know. His men tied a rope around it and hauled it out of the cellar. It banged against the wall as it rose, knocking off a chip of its sleek casing with each strike. And then Robledo didn't know what to do with it. He'd imagined a newer, smaller model of radio. His wagons were with the main force, looting Schwerin. His men could lift it, but couldn't carry it far. They tried tying it to a horse and the horse collapsed. They dragged the radio out in front of our house. Robledo smashed it to pieces with his rifle butt so that if he couldn't have it, at least we couldn't either. By the time the quartered men arrived to reinforce Grevesmullen, Heinrich Robledo was long gone. 8 Ducky. The wreckage of the radio was still outside my house when Ducky Wooler arrived in Grevesmullen. It had been there for nearly a month, but neither mother nor myself had the heart to get rid of it. He was taking a photograph of the broken radio, and I accidentally stepped into the back of the shot. He made an out-of-the-way gesture, and I told him to fuck off, and he said what, in English, and I told him to fuck off in English, and he offered to hire me as a translator, and I told him to fuck off again, and off he fucked. Ducky lingered in town, and quickly became a local laughingstock. He had not yet grown fat, but already he gave the impression of one destined for fatness. People tolerated his pictures at first, then let him take pictures if he paid them in cigarettes. He was sometimes flanked by 2 blank-faced men that everyone assumed, probably correctly, were Hansa agents. It was thanks to these men, whose names I've forgotten, that I came to work for Ducky. I happened to be in the Hart's Head on an errand, and I overheard him introducing them as the Duck's Rifles. The pun didn't work in German, but I couldn't help but bark a quick laugh. He noticed. As I left the tavern, I found Ducky matching my stride. He explained his situation to me. Grevesmullen had sucked Ducky in like mud. He had spent all his money bribing his way past the Hanseatic border, and now he had an escort but no translator and no way of getting around. He said he needed someone to provide a local touch. But more than that, I think he needed someone to care. He thought his photographs could set us free from the companies. He was starting to realize that we were our own prisoners. He needed just one person to ask to be free. Ducky walked me all the way home. He gave speeches about liberty, and when those made my eyes glaze over he told horror stories he'd heard about the companies, and when that didn't move me he gave me a box of cigarettes and promised me 2 whole cartons. Something about him reminded me of the werewolf. Not just the things he said, but the way he talked, even the way he carried himself. Maybe that's why I told him I'd think about it, as a way of apologizing. I don't know. He didn't want to let me go before I'd agreed to help him, but I insisted I was going to sleep. He scrunched up his face like a wounded dog and said, "Don't you want to do something about all this?" I manipulated the question in my head as I lay in bed. Don't you want to do something about all this? It shocked me that I'd never considered the question. I dreamt of the men hanging from the balloon, and throwing rocks at the walls of Lübeck, and laughing at Eric's jokes so hard I cried, and that man laughing as they peeled his skin off, and the joy that ran through the town after a successful raid, and my beloved radio, and the look on the werewolf's face as they dragged him away, and in the morning, I knew my answer. In actual history, Albrecht von Wallenstein was the commander of the Habsburg armies in the 30 Years' War. His forces were largely made up of mercenaries, who were supported by looting the countryside. Though a highly capable general, Wallenstein was erratic, ambitious, and untrustworthy, traits that eventually lead to his assassination on the orders of his own emperor. Company imagines a world in which the 1634 attempt on Wallenstein's life fails, and his conspirators depose Emperor Ferdinand II. The 30 Years' War, known to the characters of Company as the 60 Years' War, was devastating to Germany in real life, but the Holy Roman Empire survived as a patchwork of states rather than devolving into a no-man's land ruled by mercenary companies. The Holy Roman Empire helped defeat France in the War of Spanish Succession and Spain in the War of the Quadruple Alliance, averting the Franco-Spanish Union known in Company as the United Kingdoms. In real life, of course, the United Kingdom refers to the union of the English and Scottish thrones, which here has been divided by a powerful France's support of the Jacobite rebellions. The 1910 book Der Werwolf, about peasants defending their town from raiders in the 30 Years' War, inspired a very different guerrilla organization in real life, the Nazis' Werewolf Commando Force. And Gottlieb Daimler, inventor of the Daimler automated rifle, abandoned gunsmithing at 18 to focus on mechanical engineering. Instead of the first assault rifles, he would go on to create the first modern cars. Cars are replaced in Company by the more rudimentary autocycle, a motorized tricycle descended from the designs of Enrico Bernardi.